Thank you, and thank you very much, Emma, for that beautiful but confronting picture of the reality of our cities. To move into that a little bit further, I would like to ask you to imagine a place where you like to spend time. Perhaps that's your favourite cafe, a park where you like to go to walk your dog. The places that we live in and experience have distinctive personalities and memories for us. We've all spent a lot of time in local neighbourhoods lately during COVID, perhaps more time than we might have wanted to. You might have had a positive experience of discovering new friendships, connections, that little corner park that you'd never previously discovered. Or perhaps you've experienced social isolation. Perhaps you realised you didn't really like your neighbours after all. Perhaps you were forced to spend time in a suburb that was particularly hot and dry, like Emma pointed out, and perhaps one that didn't have the local amenities that you needed. My background's as an urban designer, which means my job is to plan and design cities, and I've spent my career working around the world, including working with the UN for the Sustainable Development Goals for cities or city-shaping projects for Google. But across the spectrum of that work, the statistic that really shocked me most was that your postcode is as likely to affect your life expectancy as your genetic code. Your postcode is as likely to affect your life expectancy as your genetic code. Now, you don't actually have to look very far to find out why, because in fact, even though we have a lot of great ideas for cities, we're actually not that great at designing places for people. It's surprising. And if you look at this neighbourhood, this is in a suburb of Melbourne called Point Cook, a typical outer suburb as you might find in many cities around the world. And what we found here is that the retail wasn't really thriving the way that it should. There's a lot of news. There's a new shopping centre, but people weren't really coming. Looking at some other statistics of the area, there was a limited amount of public space. And we were actually able to use data to measure that amenity gap, which resulted in new facilities and activations that attracted people. Now, it looks better perhaps, and more people came there, but it also increased the visitor spend by 300%. It also meant that the tenancy turnover reduced so that it was 2 years longer than it was previously, and 66% of people who visited this new space met a new neighbour. So there are very small improvements that we can make to creating better cities for people if we take the time to understand what our communities, our customers really need. But that's actually quite difficult to do because there's what we call a human data gap. We've seen fantastic world-leading technology today on the best mechanisms in the world that we have for measuring and quantifying our physical environment, and I can't wait to find out more about that. But there's also a data set about how people use and experience and move through place that helps us understand the value of those places. At Neighbourlytics, we're a social analytics platform for neighbourhoods, and we call this urban life, the everyday activity that goes on within and between buildings in a neighbourhood. It relates to how places are used, experienced, and valued. So how do you quantify that? Well, these days, we're all carrying around and creating different big data sets which can be aggregated and anonymised to help us understand where people go and what they value about neighbourhoods. We can look at public location, cell phone information. We can look at aggregated and anonymised social media data to actually understand where people go and what they value. From a Neighbourlytics perspective, we combine this into proprietary analytics that helps city decision makers really understand who their community or their customer really is and what the amenity gaps they're likely to need in that place so that we can design better places for people. Just to give you an example of that, we're standing today in a part of Sydney that you'll know called Pyrmont. We can see its physical expression on the right there. But on the left, we can see that it also has a social footprint. We can see where people spend time. We can see the type of activity that goes on relating to the colour on that map. We can see to whether that's a place that's popular based on the size of the bubble. And we can also layer that with other information that helps describe how do people describe this place in their daily experience. What's valuable to them about this particular place? This kind of information can be used to understand some key questions about city performance, such as who lives here? Basic question, but an important one to start with. What do people really care about? Is this a neighbourhood that's really about dog walking and spending time with friends, or is it a neighbourhood that's more about creative hobbies and intergenerational households? We can understand what the lifestyle habits are, how people vote with their feet, where they spend time, and put that together to benchmark and understand what the amenity gaps and priorities might be moving forward. Having looked at this information around the world in more than 2,000 neighbourhoods, we're starting to amass a picture of what lifestyle looks like, but also how it changes, because lifestyle is incredibly dynamic and something that shifts all the time. Just to give an example of this, one of the big challenges that all neighbourhoods, cities around the world are facing right now is how do we attract the best talent and investment? This question has perhaps never been so pressing as in a post-COVID environment where if you can work from anywhere, you really can work from anywhere. So that means that the city that you choose to live in needs to be able to attract you in different ways. We had the opportunity to work with a property developer in the Brooklyn Navy Yards in New York City who was looking at how some of their facilities could be repurposed to attract the world's best talent to their innovation precinct. To do that, we looked at a benchmarking exercise of looking at cities around the world and that had been successful in attracting talent through urban development projects over the past 10 years. And what we found in looking at the lifestyle footprint of these cities, which were very diverse in the way that they were culturally or physically, is that the reasons that people were visiting and attracted to these neighbourhoods most was small bars, independent retail, small streets, creative enterprises. It was the destinations, these micro destinations, that made these places unique and appealing. And that information helped feed into a strategy of activation for this larger precinct. Coming back to looking at some of the Australian context where we are today, we've been tracking 25 neighbourhoods throughout the COVID period and beyond to help understand and benchmark really questions like where did all the people really go? What are they doing now? What do we need to prioritise next, particularly if we're in property or government and thinking about how we prioritise amenities infrastructure? So there are some simple shifts that we've all experienced, but it's quite stark to put them when you quantify them, that there was a 90% drop in activity in Sydney CBD just in the first month of the COVID lockdowns. But broadening that out to how we look at other trends in different types of cities. You know, CBDs really did drop off heavily. That's something that we all know, and they're still 30% below pre-COVID activity levels. And that might not surprise you in cities that had really strong lockdowns like Melbourne or Sydney, but other cities like Darwin or Adelaide, which really didn't have extensive lockdowns, also had dramatically reduced activity. Not surprising when you look at how work from home trends have expanded. But actually that didn't happen in suburban activity centres. So when we look at places like Parramatta or Chadstone or any city that has sort of secondary cities and tiers, they actually recovered their activity levels quite quickly, even though they were still in lockdown. When we look at the suburbs, they bucked the trend completely, and other than kind of initial lockdowns, actually increased their activity over time and increased the complexity of the activity. And regional cities were similar on the most part of increasing activity. Now, that might be simplistic to look at that and think, okay, well, we kind of know that people moved out of the city, spending more time in the suburbs. But it's actually a much more complex picture than people just working from home. And I want to look at two examples of that to understand how those lifestyle shifts have actually shifted the way that people are thinking about place. One of the big drivers of change has been that the neighbourhoods that have been most successful, and by successful I mean the businesses have thrived, people have spent more time there, is that they have more than one reason to be there. They're less monocentric, monocultural, as you might find a CBD has a lot of volume of activity, but actually not a lot of diversity of reasons to be there. It's mostly about work or retail. As if you look at a suburban activity centre, it's often got hospitals, large volunteering organisations, community events, religious facilities. There's many other reasons that you might go there to visit and spend and stay other than just for work. And so when we look at that, and we're looking here at Chadstone, which is home of the largest shopping centre in the Southern Hemisphere, lots of car parks and not a lot of trees, but you'd expect that you would mostly go there for retail. And we can see that the retail is the blue line there that kind of, peaks around Christmas. But what we've seen is a flip in the reasons to visit post-COVID, in that social interactions, particularly around hospitality, have increased and is now the main reason to visit. So what many activity centres and mixed-use centres, particularly around retail, are finding is that the main driver to visit now is less about the retail destination and is much more about the social destination. So getting those, getting that hospitality mix right, and other attractions, things like bowling, cinemas, that help sort of bring social interactions, have been much greater anchors post-COVID. We've also seen that even though people are working from home more in these areas, that there is still, the employment activity hasn't shifted greatly. Now, to look at the second example, Springfield Lakes, which is a suburban development outside of Brisbane in Queensland, that there's really been a trend there that is very similar to what many suburbs have seen, is that perhaps our lifestyle footprint was typically at suburb level, like people would typically drive 20 or 30 minutes. It's really contracted down to people spending most of their time within a 20-minute walk or a 20-minute neighbourhood, and even a 5-minute walk or a 5-minute neighbourhood. So we've actually, for the most part, we've reduced our digital footprint of how we're accessing services around the city. Now, this becomes really important if we're making decisions around amenity planning and assets that exist in a city, because we need to enable enough points of interest or places, and need enough diversity of things to do within that local catchment area. So here we're looking at that Springfield Lakes area again, about what you can walk to in 10 minutes and 20 minutes, and that walkability becoming really key. I want to just finish with a quick use case on how this information has been used, particularly for public space design in new developments, which is new greenfield developments are perhaps parts of cities that are under the greatest level of transition, building and establishing suburbs often for the first time. And we worked with a developer here who'd done quite an extensive survey to understand people's lifestyle patterns. And what was coming through in that survey was a broad trend around health and well-being, and particularly interested in gyms. But here's the problem. If you ask me in a survey how often I go to the gym, what am I going to tell you? Every day, obviously. And so while surveys are great, it only really provides one sort of projected lens, and our lifestyle behaviour, such as our location, might show an more accurate picture of where we're spending time. And so what we found in this particular neighbourhood is that even though there was an interest in health and fitness, people's lifestyle patterns were, in the broader area, much more interested in engaging with nature, sport, outdoor activities, and preferred to get their health and fitness that way. And so this information was able to inform a placemaking strategy around very localised place design that then became the greatest selling attraction for this site, which sold out much faster than other developments in the region. So understanding our customer, understanding our community, understanding the amenity gaps can be a core driver of change in successful neighbourhoods. But it also has a big implication for how we understand the future of living. We know that we're living more locally in many ways than we ever before. But we're also seeking purpose and connection in places. We're also engaging with places in a way that's more digital than we ever have before, whether that's work from home or accessing click and collect from a library. But overall, if you're someone whose job it is to make decisions about cities, whether you're a property developer, you work in government, or you work in other strategies, I would be asking questions about, do you really understand the community and the customer that you're working with? Do you understand their lifestyle habits and trends, and how that information might help transform the strategies that you're doing? If you're not a city decision maker, you must be someone who lives in a neighbourhood somewhere. And I would encourage you to observe next time you're out and about. Where are people spending time? Why are those places more popular? The places that we love give us the clues to the best cities and the best future of cities. Thank you very much.